Hey there everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to talk to you about soil. Now, I know you might be thinking, soil, what's going on with that? Like, how is that biological? Well, I think you could appreciate the fact that soil contains a lot of the crucial elements that plants need to survive, and so some of those characteristics about soil are therefore very important. It's really the interface between the bio-geo, which is earth, biogeochemical cycling. And so I don't want it to be a dry conversation or dirty, but rather an interesting one. So let's have at that one and see what we can do with it. And so one of the first things that I want to say is that it's a major factor whether or not a plant can grow or not grow in a particular location. And so you notice here on this particular mountain in this picture, it looks like the rocks are very hard, and like, well, rock. What's the difference between rock and soil? And it's like, how come there isn't grass growing here, and how come there isn't a lot of vegetation? And so these are tough conditions. It may not just be the soil's poor. It could be that it's windy or some other effects up here. So let's consider that. Like, what's the story with soil? And so, right out of the gate, I mentioned that this interface between, non-life and life is critical. And so this is going to come up in future conversations when we talk about the nitrogen cycle and how plants are able to take in or assimilate nitrogen from the soil in the form of ammonium ions and nitrates and nitrites. So that's critical. And we're going to need to talk about, not in this particular conversation, about the different kinds of bacteria which are present in the soil that help to facilitate that process. And wow, so there's a lot to talk about. So plants take in phosphorus from the soil, they take in nitrogen from the soil, they take in potassium, and go on and on. And so it's critical. So what is soil? This is my question. And what's the story with rock? What's the relationship between rock and soil? And so you may know this already. This might be something of an elementary school discussion, but some of the physical factors that break down rocks are the fact that water can get into the cracks of rocks, and when it gets cold and freezes in the winter, that increases the size, and therefore it breaks the rocks up a little bit. And so it's a physical process that turns rock and breaks rock down into finer and finer particles. Now, just the fact that rock is broken down, I mean, you can stand here on the side of the road with a sledgehammer or machine and just pulverize the rock. Or if you had a really strong blender or a grinder, you can crush rock up into sand. But does that make good soil? Now, I don't think it does. Now, there's also some biological factors at play here. Like, for example, some organisms like lichen, look at the pretty colored yellow lichen here, and fungi, bacteria, mosses, all of these, and even vascular plants can accelerate the breakdown of rock by expanding into their roots into the crevices and secreting acids, etc., that will sort of disintegrate the rock and break it down into smaller particles. We talk about this in the subject of ecology when we have lichen and we have moss growing on rock, and that biologically helps to break down the rock, and then when the organisms live and die, that will eventually accumulate into humus, which is organic material that a future plant will be able to grow on, and therefore it increases the sort of the neighborhood, increases the quality of the soil. And so this is what we call primary succession, where we're breaking down rock and turning it into soil. And so lichen and other biological organisms can speed up the breakdown and convert rock into soil. But ultimately it comes down to this, if you've got some good topsoil, so soil on the top, what is it? It's not just rock, but you've got some living organisms in it mixed in there. Like, maybe not anything that you could see. A lot of them are microscopic. And this term humus, it's this partially decayed organic material. What does that mean? Well, that means that if there was something living there, whether it had been moss or lichen or even a big plant like this, when something dies, you've got bacteria breaking them down. And one of the things that bacteria can do is take larger macromolecules like proteins, which have amino acids, and you get these bacteria, like these ammonifying bacteria, that can break down amino acids into ammonium ion. And that's the source of nitrogen in the soil that the future plant, not the dead one, but the future plant can, hey, maybe I'll grow there. And so this plant sort of facilitates or paves the way for others to come in. So ammonifying bacteria are very crucial. So they're increasing the nitrogen by breaking down the humus. So this is the organic material. It's sort of like a compost pile. If you throw a banana peel right there, ultimately it's the ammonifying bacteria that are going to break down the protein in the banana into ammonium ions and therefore increase the quality of the soil. And so, boy, there's a lot of scientists that study soil, and I know that biology, it's a bit of a tangent to the study of biology, but of course if you're studying plants, which we are, it's certainly relevant. And so I yield to the geologists in terms of this. My knowledge of soil is maybe as thick as only the topsoil. This is what's called a horizon. This person isn't digging himself as a grave, but you can take pictures of his. Do you notice how the top horizon, when I say it's kind of stratified, do you notice here that the top part is a little darker? It's darker because that's where most of the decaying organic matter is. That's where the humus is located, in this top section. And so plants like that the best. And so, what's below it here? I thought, maybe you're thinking, I thought soil has clay in it. It does have clay in it. And what about like the sand that you were talking about before in terms of like rocks? Big rocks, small rocks. What about some silt? Well, it's got all those things. It's got decaying material, it's got some sand, and it has some silt, and it has clay. And so all of those are different sizes and they have different properties. And so the blend of those things make up soil. So that's what we're talking about. And so you could study these horizons like that. It's a vertical profile of what the soil looks like. Kind of cool. If you wanted to study this more, you'd study geology or environmental science. You could really get into that. And so the texture of topsoil really depends on the size of the particles. And they go from either coarse sand, you're familiar with this from the sandbox, to clay, and you're familiar with that from maybe arts and crafts. Clay is kind of this gushy material. And so fertile soil, if you will, is considered to be kind of loamy, or it's made up of loams, which is equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay. So all three of these particles, and they have different sizes. So the clay is very small, and sand's very large, and silt is sort of in between. And so if you have soil that has a lot of these three major groups, tends to hold water. If you're familiar with clay, clay tends to really absorb water well. Like you could stick clay into water and it acts like a sponge, and you're like, yes, clay is the best for soil because then it'll absorb water and it'll be great. Too much clay, it's a problem. The soil gets too much water and the plants suffocate. And it's like, well, maybe if we had a little bit of sand in there. And you're like, sand's not very good. I know that if you're at the beach and you pour water on sand, the water will just travel right through it. It's very bad. Well, a little mixture of these two and allows for good aeration. That's good that the water percolates through the sand. See? Air is needed for the roots. The roots need oxygen. Where are they getting oxygen? Or how are they going to survive? Cell respiration in the root. They're not going to transport oxygen down from the leaves. The roots need their own oxygen, and so sand provides that. So you need a little bit of all three of these things, sand, silt, and clay. Yeah. And so it's a combination of that. And so loamy soils are a nice blend of these three things, and most garden plants like that. And so when you buy a bag of soil, sad that you have to buy a bag of soil. It contains loamy soil. And so again, these fine particles in like, for example, the clay help to retain water. They adhere to the water. This is water adhering to clay. And it also contains some coarse material that will allow oxygen to circulate through it, like, for example, sand. Now, here's an example of some odd stuff. People like the odd stories. And so, well, I just wanted to finish our conversation for a moment. So inadequate drainage can either, like, if there's too much water, the plants can suffocate because there's not enough air. And so, and also, like, if you think you're doing your plants a good thing by just pouring in water, like say you're going away on a vacation and you're like, well, I'm going to be away for a whole month, so I'm just going to try get a big liter of water and just pour it onto my plant, and that probably will kill it because it's going to suffocate. Because as it turns out, oxygen doesn't dissolve very well in water, unlike carbon dioxide that does. And so dissolved oxygen is very low. And so some plants, can you believe this, like in the jungles right here, in swampy areas, some plants, for example mangroves, can grow with their roots in the water. See, there you go. That's very unusual. You're like, how can that survive? There's no oxygen per se in the water. Well, their root system is really cool. It's modified, and it has these, it's hollow, which it's sort of like a snorkel that comes up, you know, when you're snorkeling around and you have your little pipe up there where you can get your oxygen. That's what these roots are. They're modified like snorkels that will allow oxygen to come in so that the root system can survive. Oh, pretty interesting. So one of the things about soil, topsoil in particular, is that there's an astonishing number of organisms that live there. Most of them are microscopic. Most of them are bacteria. But of course, there's a whole variety of fungi that live in the soil. And there's some big guys too, like worms, for example. And so, and even some nematodes, some insects, all kinds of things. You're like, well, see, this is why I don't like the soil, you might be thinking. But change that. The soil's interesting. So all of that, not to mention, you know, broken up plants and roots and things like that. So it's a potpourri, but there's lots of bacteria there, mainly. And the activity of these organisms alter the soil. So the organisms themselves like play with the soil a little bit. Like, for example, earthworms, what do? When they burrow through, they actually create like air. They provide tunnels where air can circulate through, and they secrete mucus, and that can help bind soil together and hold it firm. And they also, this is kind of cool, the earthworm will take in soil through its digestive system and partially break down some of this humus, this decomposing organic material like proteins and sugars and fats. It's basically organic molecules, and then it doesn't totally digest it or what I want to say, absorb it. And so when it poops it out, that breaks it up. So it's like the digestive process of worms is making the nutrients more available for plants because it's breaking it down. It's sort of like taking food and chewing it up and then spitting it out, and then maybe like a small, this is kind of gross, a small child would be able to eat it because it's been broken down already. I just thought of that, sorry. So bacteria in the soil obviously alter the mineral composition, because I was mentioning this before. This ammoniifying bacteria will break down humus into ammonium ions, not to mention one of the most important bacteria of all, that can nitrogen fixing bacteria that can literally pull nitrogen gas out of the air. You're like, I thought we were talking about soil. Yes, the bacteria are in the soil, and they pull it out of the air and turn it into ammonium ions, and therefore increase the nitrogen level in the soil. So the activity of organisms can alter the soil composition. Yeah, and also plants themselves, when they extract water, will affect the the quality of moisture in the soil, and therefore will influence erosion, etc. So organisms living in there, not to mention fungi and how important they are in breaking things down. So humus is all this decaying. It's like a big compost pile. And so this is what we should be thinking is anything that we're eating around the house, bananas or apples, or it doesn't even have to be a fruit. It's like any eggshells, anything that was alive should never be thrown in the trash. It should be thrown in the compost pile because it'll then be broken down by these microscopic bacteria and fungi into smaller, more obtainable packets so that plants can assimilate that. So in other words, the banana peel will then be broken down by ammoniifying bacteria into ammonium, and then plants will be able to take it up. So basically, when you throw your leftover food, whether they be bones or whatever, on top of soil, basically the microorganisms are therefore going to convert it and make the soil more nutritious. This is what we should be doing. This is, I think, what we are doing. And so this part right here I find is really, really interesting right here. I tend to like the chemistry of this. So here's down into the soil. Here's the root here. Here's the epidermis. You're like, okay, water's coming in through osmosis, to blah, blah, blah. Okay, we had talked before about how the root pushes out hydrogen ions into the soil to create a positive environment. Let me start doing this. Creates a positive environment that inside is negative, and so that increases the plant root's ability to take in cations, because then they're attracted to the negative epidermal cells. And you're like, okay, yes, I recall that. It was very interesting. So check this out, though. This is even more interesting. You may not have known this, like soil particles, in particular clay, not only adhere to water really well, but they tend to be negative clay. And as it turns out, that means that all these cations, like potassium and copper and magnesium and calcium, even sodium, all these things tend to cling on clay. And you're like, okay, well, if it's clinging on clay, that's good for one thing. That means that those elements are present, those ions are present in the soil. That's good. But then if they're clinging too hard, sort of like a magnet, the root, how's the root going to like pull it off? These are like little beads that are stuck. Like, can't pull it off, can't pull it off, can't pull it off. So check this out. In addition to the proton pump, this is another mechanism of how roots can take in cations. Check this out. When they breathe out carbon dioxide, you're like, I didn't know that they were breathing out carbon dioxide. Sure, the mitochondria produces that in the Krebs cycle during respiration. So did you know this? When carbon dioxide dissolves into water, so that's just like blowing bubbles into a glass of water, this chemical reaction produces carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, and then carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion, which is negative, and protons. And so by just breathing carbon dioxide like this, the root hairs increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the soil, and then that replaces, it's like these hydrogen ions sort of like are attracted to the clay, and they help to then free the other minerals from the clay so that the root can actually take in potassium and calcium and magnesium. Isn't that kind of interesting? Like, check this out. Just to drive that point home a little bit, let me come over here. I found this, just kind of poking around, and I found this kind of silly video here of this television show, and here's this scientist who is making, you might remember this from chemistry, you could make a pH indicator by crushing up red cabbage in a blender and then straining it. And so this juice is just basically cabbage and water, cabbage juice and water. And it's a chemical indicator. And so if you were to change the pH, like for example, let's check this out, an unknown liquid, he's pouring this in, and you're like, what is this? Well, it's turning kind of a bluish green color. And that might be, if you remember your chemistry, that might be indicative of the fact that that's a weak base. So that was ammonia. Yes, you called it. And then you can pour in some acid. Look at that, like some vinegar. And that turns it red, so that lowers the pH. You're like, yes, this is very cool in the graduated cylinder, but what's my point on this? Well, you could use other pH indicators. Like, for example, this chemical is a blue chemical called bromothymol blue. And let me just pause it here for a second. And so bromothymol blue is a chemical indicator for pH. And so it's blue in color, but in the presence of an acid, it'll turn yellow. And so that's how you know that it's an acid. And you're like, well, I don't see him pouring the vinegar in. Well, over here in this graduated cylinder, do you see this? He has water and dried ice. So what he's holding on in his hand is not water, frozen water, but it's frozen carbon dioxide. It's really, really, really cold. So when you put carbon dioxide into water, watch this. When you drop carbon dioxide into water, look at all the carbon dioxide that's being produced there. It's turning this from blue to green to yellow. So this is extremely acidic. And so my point is, you could do this with an ordinary, if you had some bromothymol blue, you can put that in and simply blow into it. And so what my point of this is, if I have a point, and I think I do, like the point of this is that this is what the plants are doing. They're producing not that much carbon dioxide like the dry ice, but they're producing carbon dioxide. It's making it really acidic over here, and the acid is therefore releasing the cations from the clay so that it could take it in. Pretty cool. And so we call that cation exchange. Cation, like gato. So the positively charged minerals are made available to plants when they release protons, not only in the proton pump, but also in this when they breathe out CO2 and they release those cations from the clay particles. Kind of neat. So clay in general, when there's a lot of clay and all those ions are attaching to it, it prevents the leaching when it rains. So that's kind of a good thing. And so when minerals are, when there's not a lot of clay in the soil, and it rains and it rains and it rains, sometimes you can lose a lot of minerals from runoff. You know, it's interesting is the negative ions that are in the soil, which are also very, very important, such things like nitrate and phosphates and sulfates. These are not as tightly bound, and so these are the ones that are more vulnerable to heavy rainfall. These are the things that are leached out of the soil. One of the things that you can do to prevent these anions from running off is to have lots of vegetation. Because if you cut down a forest, for example, clear cut it, then what's going to happen when it rains? The root system isn't going to hold the soil in place, and all these important anions are then going to run off. And you're like, well, I'm not really. You should be concerned about that, because if the loggers claim to be planting more trees, they're not going to plant. They're not going to grow really well without all this minerals in the soil. And by the way, where is all this running off? It's running off probably down a watershed into a creek or a river, and that's going to increase that, and it's going to grow algae. It's going to grow, and it's going to be eutrophication if it goes into a lake, and algae, and it's going to lower the dissolved oxygen. It's going to be chaos. And so now the rest of this conversation is about, well, now that we know that soil is really important, let's conserve it. So this is a blend of like conservation biology, but it's called soil conservation. And it's one of the steps toward sustainable agriculture is trying to conserve soil. So right out of the gate, I know agriculture is really, really important. This is how we get our food. But the truth is agriculture is kind of an unnatural process. It turns out that what we're talking about and how organic material is broken down takes centuries, hundreds of years for soil to become fertile and accumulate all this organic material. And so what do? Humans come in and we grow crops, like for example wheat, and then we harvest it. And when we harvest it, what does that mean? We basically take, the minerals are either in the soil or in the plants themselves. The plants take it up, then it's in the plant. If we remove the plant and we put it onto a truck like this, and then we drive it away or put it onto a train, fly it around the world, you're basically taking the nutrients away from the soil. And just in a few years, you could reduce the nutrient quality of the soil. Now, this is mismanagement. You don't want to do that. You want to have soil that is, it's a compromise. It's like humans need to understand this. And this is an important lesson. You might be familiar with this in a study of U.S. history. When this actually happened in the 1930s in the southern western United States in the Great Plains, right before World War II, in the 1930s, farmers were, when they were living in this area, they were removing a lot of the normal wild grass that was found in this area. Why? So that they can grow their own crops, and they can also have places where cattle can be raised. And so when they did that, they removed sort of the hardy grass that was normally present, and then there was a big drought, so there was no water. And so what happened was, when there's no water, and then there was a lot of wind and wind and wind, and so for several years the drought lasted, and because of all this wind, and there's no vegetation there, a lot of the topsoil blew away. And when the topsoil blew away, that meant that there's no good humus in the soil, so nothing would grow there. And so this was tragic. And so if you recall this book by John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, this is all about this dust bowl that occurred in the United States. And so right out of the gate, I just wanted to say that agriculture is unnatural. It's normally, you're like, what's normal? Normal is when a plant grows and then it dies, the nutrients are cycled locally. And so what happens is when we come in and we grow wheat like this and we harvest it, we come in and we like pull it all up, we can deplete the soil. You know, like how much are we depleting? We can deplete it, look at this, a ton of wheat, okay, which is not even that much, a ton of wheat, the soil has to give up 18 kilograms of nitrogen, 3 kilograms of phosphorus and potassium, not to mention all of the other minerals, but these are the three big ones, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And so the fertility diminishes over time. And so you need to replenish it, not to mention that most of the crops that we grow require way more water than is naturally present in those areas. And so we have to supply water as well. That's called irrigation. And so what are we going to do? We're going to add fertilizer to the soil to improve the crops in the future years. Now, this could be natural fertilizer. Like in the past, what have we used? Like animal poo, manure, we could use fish carcass. You know, in other words, we were trying to create our own little compost here by using fertilizer. And then, you know, when we wanted to step the game up, we can use commercial fertilizers. You can go in and buy this at the gardening store even. There's bags and bags of this, and they're all marked with different quantities. Basically, they're called 10, 12, 8 or 12, 10, 5. It's basically 10% nitrogen, 12% phosphorus, 8% potassium. These are the three things that plants really need. So plant food or miracle grow, look for that. These are the elements that are in there. Well, if you keep doing that, basically it's fine, but there's a problem with that, in that whether it be fish meal or manure, or if you use which are organic, in other words, non-synthesized fertilizer, ultimately, I mean, there's not really a problem with it. I mean, plants are going to be taking that up and they're going to absorb it. And I wanted to say one thing before you become like a reactionary and you can have a kind of a clear head on this. In the end, most people don't realize this. Whether or not you're putting like cow manure or horse manure onto your crops, into your garden, or if you're using a bag of fertilizer from the gardening store that's synthesized, it makes no difference if it comes from a chemical factory or an organic fertilizer. Ultimately, those nitrogen compounds and those phosphorus and that potassium, it's all the same thing. If poo is being broken down into ammonium or nitrate, nitrite, what's the difference? It's all the same thing. And so you could be kind of fooled a little bit by whether or not one thing is healthier than another. If I ask people if organic fertilizer is healthier than chemical fertilizer, yes, it's the same thing. The plant just takes it in, the same thing. The thing is, excessive fertilizer, and I mentioned this, if you put too much on there, and people tend to because the plants like that, excess tends to get pulled off and it goes into groundwater. That's a problem if the neighborhood is using groundwater for its source of water. It can go into streams and lakes, and it's a real problem, eutrophication. And then likewise, some of these minerals will affect the pH. Like if the pH is too acid or too basic, it'll affect whether or not the plant is able to take up the appropriate element or not. And so that's important. So adjusting the pH of the soil, first you have to determine what the pH is. And so sulfates lower it, like sulfuric acid. And so liming, you can add lime to it, which would increase it. So these are your basic ways in which you can lower it or raise it if you're a farmer. And so that's kind of important. You have to know what you're dealing with in terms of the mineral needs of your crop. And you know, sometimes you can't control it, as you may be familiar with that we're experiencing a lot of acid rain. And so the soil is becoming more and more acid, as well as the oceans are becoming more and more acidified. The pH is lowering. You're like, I'm not too concerned. You should be concerned about it. That influences whether or not the crop can take in the proper nutrients or not. Sometimes plants will take in excessive ammonia as a result of the soil being acidic, and it can kill the plant. Oh, so it's critical. Even, see, when you talk about environmental science, it can be kind of gloomy, but you know, there's hope in the end if we do the right thing. Even just simple irrigation, in other words, spraying water. You're like, what can spraying water, how can that be harmful to the soil? Well, this is not distilled water. This is like maybe tap water or something like this. There's minerals in there. There's solutes in there, even though it's drinking water. And so when you keep spraying this on there, what's happening is transpiration is removing the pure water, sort of like the distilled water evaporates, but all those solutes, that salt, is building and building and building into the soil. And actually, the soil becomes too salty after years and years of watering it. And so when the soil becomes too salty, that's going to obviously be lethal to the plant, because the plant's going to, instead of like reverse osmosis, it's going to lose water when you grow it in salty soil as opposed to take it in. And then salt lowers the water potential. And so, you know, the truth is we're out of control, humanity. We're taking places like deserts, like where Las Vegas is, and we're building huge lakes, and we're tapping into natural fresh water from the Colorado River. We're out of control. We're building golf courses with lakes and in the desert in Arizona. It's not sustainable. So what we're talking about is sustainability and conservation. And so topsoil is very important, and even wind and water can sort of erode it. And so farmers are getting really clever. You can build terraces here on the slopes, which will prevent erosion and reduce wind. You can even plant trees next to your crop to reduce wind loss right there, so topsoil won't be blown away. Also, trees encourage predators to come into the area and sort of eat your insects that are messing with your crops. So hillside terracing in China, it's kind of cool. And then sustainable agriculture is basically trying to keep the environment safe and profitable. In other words, we want our farmers to make money because they're the ones that are making food for us all. We want everyone to benefit, and so we have to maintain balance. And so the final thing that I want to say is sometimes one of the things that can happen in soil is that there can be some toxics, some heavy metal can be found in soils, and therefore most plants can't grow there. But then we discovered that some plants can take in these heavy metals and they're fine with it. And so we thought, hey, these are like little sponges. We'll grow these plants, and they'll suck up all these toxic minerals from it, and then we'll rip those out, and then we'll use this area for farming. That's pretty good. So this is called phyto for plant remediation. In other words, to make the area better, like remediate an area by using plants. This is an area, I don't know if you're familiar with this, this is by Candlestick Park over in San Francisco in a place called Visitation Valley. It's the Bayshore train station. Now, it's no longer a train station. Maybe there's a smaller one over here, but a lot of this area, which is great land, it could be used for, I don't know, growing crops or whatever, but it's not being used because there's a lot of metals as a result of the train yard being there, and so they're trying to plant plants that will help pull that out. And then even over here in the Presidio of San Francisco, back when the Army used the Presidio as a military fort, these are the bunkers where they had big artillery cannons over here. Apparently there's been some damage done to the soil, and so the naturalists and rangers and biologists here in the Bay Area are using this alpine pennycrest, and what that can do is it can accumulate zinc. Apparently there's a lot of zinc in the soil, and so it can pull that up and therefore you remediate the soil and therefore make the soil a little bit better for the future. So this is what we're talking about. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation today about soil. Thanks for watching.